The clocks that caused a neighborhood incident. Chapter 1. The man, the kitchen, and the great clock debate of Birkenweg Lane. Mr. Lukas Hoffmann was, by most accounts, an entirely unremarkable man. And he would have taken that as a tremendous compliment. He was 67 years old, a little soft around the middle in the way that men who enjoy good bread tend to be, with a neat white mustache that he trimmed every Sunday morning, using a small pair of scissors he kept in the left drawer of his bathroom cabinet. He wore the same style of cardigan in 3 different colors: gray, dark gray, and what the label called slate, but was, in every practical sense, also gray. He had lived in the same cream-colored house on the outskirts of Vienna for 31 years, tended the same patch of garden, and had been buying his morning bread from the same bakery on Birkenweg Lane, since the previous owner's father had run the place. He was, in short, a man of cheerful habit. The house itself was modest and warm, smelling perpetually of wood smoke in the winter, and of something herby and pleasant in the summer. A combination of the lavender growing wild along the back fence, and whatever was simmering on the stove. Neighbors had described it variously as cozy, tidy, and, once, memorably, by old Mrs. Brandt from number 14, as the sort of place that makes you want to sit down and not bother going home. There were 2 things in Mr. Lucas's kitchen, however, that were not at all unremarkable. And they had, over the course of the past year, become something of a local obsession. They were clocks. 2 of them, side by side, hanging on the wall above the kitchen table with the confidence of objects that knew exactly what they were doing, even if no one else was entirely sure. They were not identical. The left one was a round, dark walnut clock with Roman numerals that Lukas had inherited from his own father, a serious-looking thing that had hung in various kitchens across 3 generations of Hoffmanns, and had, in that time, developed the faint air of an object that considered itself important. The right one was newer, more cheerful, cream-colored with simple black numerals and a slightly jaunty tick. The kind of clock you might buy at a perfectly nice shop on a perfectly nice afternoon and feel very sensible about. Lukas had bought it at exactly such a shop, on exactly such an afternoon, approximately 14 months ago. They did not show the same time. Specifically, the walnut clock on the left showed the correct local Vienna time, and the cream clock on the right showed the time in Toronto, Canada, where Lucas's son Edward lived, worked, and had been building his life for the past 4 years. In the summer months, when daylight saving time aligned in its particular way between Europe and North America, Toronto ran 6 hours behind Vienna. The right-hand clock, therefore, was always 6 hours slow. Or, depending on your philosophical outlook, 6 hours ahead of itself in a different direction. This was entirely logical. This was, Mr. Lukas felt, rather clever. His neighbors did not agree. The first person to notice had been Georg Pickler from number 9. Who had stopped by one Tuesday in March of the previous year to return a borrowed drill, and had ended up staying for coffee, as one did at Mr. Lucas's, because there was always coffee, and there was always something baked, and it would have been rude to rush. Georg was a large, well-meaning man who worked in insurance, and approached most of life's puzzles with the same professionally cautious energy he brought to policy assessments. He had glanced at the 2 clocks, glanced again, set down his coffee cup, and stared. "Lukas," he said carefully. "Your clocks." "Yes," said Lukas pleasantly, refilling his own cup. They don't match. No. Lukas agreed. They don't. Georg waited. Lukas did not appear to be about to elaborate. Georg tried a different angle. Is one of them broken? No. Are you sure? Because that one. Georg pointed at the cream clock. Is quite a bit behind. 6 hours. Lukas confirmed. Yes. That's a lot. It's the exact right amount, said Lukas, with the serenity of a man who had worked this out and was at peace with it. Georg left 20 minutes later with his drill, and a vague sense that he had missed something. He mentioned it to his wife, Hild, that evening over dinner. Hild mentioned it to Renata from number 11 at the community garden the following Saturday. Renata mentioned it to at least 4 other people. By the time April arrived, the 2 clocks of Mr. Lukas Hoffmann's kitchen had become a topic of quiet, dedicated neighborhood speculation. Theories multiplied. The most popular early theory, championed by Georg, was that one clock was simply broken and Mr. Lukas hadn't noticed. This theory had a comfortable, problem-solving energy to it. It suggested that all that was required was for someone to helpfully tell Mr. Lukas that his clock was wrong, at which point he would say, "Oh goodness, so it is," and adjust it, and everything would be resolved. This was the theory of a man who liked resolutions. The second theory, proposed by Renata's husband Thomas, who had once read a book about psychology and had never quite recovered from it, was that Mr. Lukas had suffered some kind of temporal confusion following a difficult period, and was subconsciously keeping a clock set to a time when life had been different. Thomas said this with the gentle gravity of a man diagnosing something important. His wife told him to stop. The third theory, offered by young Mrs. Capeler from the end of the lane, who was 29, rather creative, and had recently developed a strong interest in antiques, was that the walnut clock might be extremely valuable, and Mr. Lukas might be afraid to touch it in case it stopped, and so instead of adjusting it, he was simply living around it. This theory said more about Mrs. Capeler's recent purchase of an allegedly rare 19th-century barometer than it did about the clocks, but she stood by it. None of them, it should be noted, had yet thought to simply ask Mr. Lukas directly. This was because directly asking felt, somehow, like it might end the speculation. And the speculation had become the most interesting thing on Birkenweg Lane, since the Petersons' cat had got into the community storage shed and reorganized, in some inexplicable feline way, the contents of the Christmas decoration boxes. It was on a Thursday in early June that the neighborhood's curiosity finally overcame its manners. Mr. Lukas was in his kitchen at the time, which was where he always was on a Thursday at 2:30, and he was doing exactly what he always did on a Thursday at 2:30. Brewing tea. This was not just any tea. This was a ritual. Mr. Lukas had developed it over the 14 months since his son Edward had moved to his second apartment in Toronto. The first had been drafty, Edward had said. The second had a better view and a functional radiator, which seemed worth the extra cost. The ritual had 3 components. First, the kettle. The good one. The copper one with the slightly fussy handle that Lukas had to hold just so, because otherwise it dripped. It went on the stove with fresh cold water, not a kettle full but not skimped either. Exactly enough for 2 cups, which was how Lukas always made it, the second cup being a companionable fiction he'd developed and rather liked. Second, the tin. It lived in the third cupboard from the left, and contained a loose leaf blend he ordered twice yearly from a small tea merchant in Salzburg. He would measure out exactly the right amount into the pot, which had belonged to his late wife, Marta, and was white with a small blue flower on the lid. The measuring was done with a small silver spoon, and accompanied by the kind of comfortable silence that people who live alone either find oppressive or deeply pleasurable. Lukas found it deeply pleasurable. Third, and this was the part of the ritual that had recently become, unbeknownst to him, an object of intense neighborhood fascination. He would stand at the kitchen table and look up at the 2 clocks on the wall. He would glance from one to the other. He would nod, the way people nod at numbers that confirm what they already knew. And then, depending on what the clocks showed, he would either sit down to wait for his tea to steep, or he would reach for the phone on the counter. The rule was simple. Whenever the hour hand of either clock pointed to 8, he called Edward. If the right-hand clock, the Toronto one, showed 8 in the morning, that meant it was 2 in the afternoon in Vienna, which was precisely when Lukas was standing in his kitchen with a pot of tea and nothing more pressing to do. That was the common trigger, the one that happened most days. And if, on the occasional evening, the left clock showed 8 Vienna time, then it was 2 in the afternoon in Toronto, and Edward would sometimes step away from his desk for a few minutes, if the day wasn't too mad. This was, Lukas felt, a beautifully elegant system. 2 clocks, 2 time zones, 1 rule, and a pot of tea. He was rather proud of it. Chapter 2. An explanation is given, and promptly misunderstood. The deputation arrived on a Thursday, which was either a coincidence or the result of careful reconnaissance, depending on how generously you interpreted the social habits of the residents of Birkenweg Lane. There were 4 of them. Georg Pickler, who had appointed himself spokesperson on the grounds that he had discovered the clocks first. Renata from number 11, who had brought a small cake because she felt social calls should involve food. Thomas, Renata's husband, who had come along mainly because Renata had come along. And Mrs. Brandt from number 14, who was 81 years old, had strong opinions about everything, and had decided that if the neighborhood was going to investigate the clock situation, she intended to be present for it. Mr. Lukas opened the door with the relaxed hospitality of a man who genuinely liked people stopping by and had nowhere particular to be. Come in," he said, already moving toward the kitchen. "Tea's just brewed. Georg, you look like you've been thinking about something. Renata, that cake smells wonderful. Thomas. Ingrid." He nodded to Mrs. Brandt with the particular respect one gave to people who had been alive for 8 decades and clearly intended to keep going. They settled around the kitchen table, which was not enormously large but managed, as good kitchen tables do, to accommodate everyone comfortably. Lukas set out cups and the plate that Renata's cake was efficiently transferred onto. The atmosphere was pleasant. The kitchen smelled of tea and, faintly, of the lavender from the garden. Afternoon light came through the window at a warm angle. For a few minutes, everyone simply had tea and remarked on the cake, which was a plum and almond thing that was extremely good. Then Georg cleared his throat. "Lukas," he said, "we wanted to ask you about the clocks." Lukas glanced up at the wall, as if seeing them fresh, then back at Georg with an expression of mild curiosity. "What about them?" "Well," Georg said, settling into his spokesperson role, "they show different times." "They do?" Lukas agreed. One of them, Georg continued carefully, as a man does when he's trying not to sound like he's breaking difficult news, is 6 hours slow. The right one, Lukas said helpfully. The cream one. Yes. And, well, is it broken? Mr. Lukas looked at the cream clock with what could only be described as gentle affection, as one might look at a pet that had just been asked if it was confused. Not at all, he said. It's working perfectly. It shows the time in Toronto. There was a pause. Several people around the table looked at each other. Toronto, Georg repeated. Canada, Lukas added, in case anyone was thinking of a different Toronto. My son Edward lives there. It's 6 hours behind us in the summer. Ah, said Renata, with the slow, dawning warmth of someone to whom something sweet has just been explained. You have one clock for here and one for there. Exactly, said Lukas, pleased, pointing at Renata the way a teacher points at the student who has just given the right answer. That way, when I'm making my afternoon tea, I don't have to do arithmetic in my head. I just look up. If the Toronto clock shows 8 in the morning, that's when Edward is just starting his day and is usually more or less cheerful. Or if my Vienna clock shows 8 in the evening, which is 2 in the afternoon for him, and he sometimes has a free moment then. Either way, I call. He said this with such comfortable simplicity, such complete satisfaction with the ingenuity of his own system, that it was impossible not to feel that here was a man who had solved a problem neatly and knew it. Mrs. Brandt set down her teacup with a small decisive click. That, she said, is perfectly sensible. She said it the way she said most things. With the finality of someone whose opinions had been formed over 8 decades and were not available for debate. Georg looked slightly deflated. He had, on some level, been hoping for a problem to solve. The problem had solved itself. He ate more cake. Thomas, however, was looking at the clocks with the expression of a man whose psychology book had not prepared him for simplicity. But doesn't it confuse you? He asked. Having 2 different times in the same room? Lukas considered this genuinely. A little, at first, he admitted. The first week I kept catching the Toronto clock out of the corner of my eye, and feeling vaguely sorry for Edward. Thinking, oh, it's only 8 in the morning for him. He's barely started his day. And then I'd look at the Vienna clock and feel the difference all over again. 6 hours is quite a lot when you think about it. He's finishing lunch while I'm finishing dinner. He's having his morning coffee while I'm having my afternoon tea. He paused. But you get used to it very quickly. Now I don't even notice the gap. I just read them together, like 2 sentences that belong to the same story. The left clock is Vienna. The right clock is Edward. He smiled. It's rather nice, actually. I can see what time it is for him without asking. If I'm going to bed, I know he's still at dinner. It makes him feel less far away. There was a small silence around the table that had a different quality from the earlier pauses. This one was softer, more considered. Renata made a small sound that might have been, ah, but that she turned, just in time, into a polite cough. Well, said Georg, recovering his authority in the way people do when they realize the meeting has gone unexpectedly well and want some credit for it. That all makes very good sense. I'm glad we cleared that up. Was there confusion? Lukas asked, genuinely curious. "Oh, just a little neighborly interest," Renata said diplomatically. "You know how it is. Something a bit different catches people's attention." "Ah." Lukas nodded. "Well, you're welcome to come look at them any time. Both working perfectly." He said this to the clocks as much as to the assembled neighbors, with the contentment of a man reviewing his affairs and finding them in good order. As they left, with thanks for the tea, a promise to bring the recipe for the plum cake, and Mrs. Brandt's parting declaration that the whole affair was the most sensible thing she'd heard all week, which wasn't saying much, frankly. Georg paused at the door. "You know," he said, looking back at the kitchen wall, "I might get one of those for us. My daughter lives in New Zealand." "What time is it there now?" Lukas asked. Georg calculated briefly, got confused, and gave up. "That's exactly why I should get the clock," he said. Chapter 3. Word spreads. As it always does. The thing about neighborhoods is that they are, at their core, enormous engines of information distribution with a thin layer of community spirit stretched over the top. By Friday morning, the explanation of Mr. Lucas's clocks had reached every household within a 4-street radius. The delivery was not always perfectly accurate. Information passing through 8 or 9 different tellers tends to develop, as it goes, a kind of editorial drift. But the essential facts survived. Mr. Lukas had 2 clocks, one for Vienna and one for Toronto. And he used them to know when to call his son. The reaction to this information was almost universally positive, with the slight undertone of embarrassment that comes when a neighborhood realizes it has spent considerable time speculating about something that turned out to have an entirely reasonable explanation. "I feel a bit silly," Hild Pickler said to Georg, when he relayed the details over breakfast. "I kept thinking someone should tell him his clock was wrong." "Everyone thought that," Georg said, which was generous of him, since he had been the one most vocally thinking it. "Did anyone actually try to fix it?" "No. Everyone assumed someone else would." Hild considered this. "That's probably for the best." The information also reached Mrs. Leubner from the bakery on the corner, who told it to approximately 23 customers over the course of Friday morning while handing over bread, and who embellished it slightly with the detail that Mr. Lukas had built the clocks himself, which was not true, but which added a pleasing craftsmanship element to the story that several people appreciated. It reached Mr. Horvath, who was 93 and rarely went out but received all neighborhood news through a chain of relatives, and was, by Friday afternoon, in possession of a version of the story in which Mr. Lukas had 2 sons, one in Toronto and one in Tokyo, and had arranged the clocks in binary code. Mr. Horvath found this very impressive and told it to his nephew at the weekend. It reached the Community Garden Committee, who, at their monthly meeting that Friday evening, briefly discussed whether a commemorative clock might be appropriate for the garden's entrance, then decided that was probably excessive and moved on to the matter of the disputed composting rota. And it reached, via a circuitous path that involved 3 separate phone calls and 1 text message, a young woman named Petra who wrote a local interest column for a small regional newspaper, and who immediately thought, "That's a lovely little piece." Petra arrived the following Tuesday morning, which Mr. Lukas had not been expecting, but which he handled with his customary equanimity, offering her the chair with the slightly better cushion and making tea before she'd quite finished explaining who she was. She was 26, enthusiastic, and had a small notebook and an expression of professional warmth that Lukas recognized as the face of someone who liked their job. "So?" she said, notebook open, pen poised. The clocks." "The clocks," Lukas agreed pleasantly. "I'd love to write about them. If that's all right. I can't imagine why anyone would want to read about my kitchen wall," Lukas said. "But I'm happy to have the company." Petra smiled. She was already getting the sense that this was going to be a very easy interview. "Can you tell me about them? How did you come up with the idea?" Lukas thought for a moment, his hands wrapped around his cup in the comfortable way of someone for whom tea and conversation were equally nourishing. "Edward, my son, moved to Toronto about 4 years ago," he said. "He works in engineering. Something to do with city infrastructure, water management, I think." He explains it and I nod and understand perhaps 40%. He said this without embarrassment, with the cheerful honesty of a man who had made peace with the limits of his expertise. "Anyway, the time difference was always something I had to think about. I'd want to call and I'd have to work out. Is it a reasonable hour there? Is he at work? Is he asleep? I'd get it wrong sometimes. Called him once at 6 in the morning his time. He was very gracious about it. He always is." Lukas paused, turning his cup gently in his hands. "The second clock was Marta's idea, in a way. My wife. She passed 5 years ago." Petra nodded, keeping her expression warm and steady. "I'm sorry. She was very practical," Lukas said, with a small, fond smile. "She always said that if a problem could be solved by looking at a wall, you should hang the solution on the wall. So I thought, well, why not? Buy a second clock, set it to Toronto time, hang it next to the first. And then you just look." He shrugged. A small, satisfied shrug. "It cost €11. I have no idea why I didn't think of it sooner." "And the rule about calling at 8? Edward starts work at 9. He's usually awake by 7:30, has his coffee, has a bit of time. 8 is good. And 8 in the evening his time. That's 2 in the morning for me, which I'm generally not awake for, but 8 Vienna time in the evening is 2 in the afternoon there, and he sometimes has his lunch hour free. So the rule is, when either clock shows 8, it's a good time to call." He glanced up at the clocks. "Like a signal. It feels nicer than just picking up the phone and hoping." Petra had stopped taking notes at some point during this and was simply listening. She started writing again. "And the neighbors thought the clock was broken?" Lukas's eyes lit with gentle amusement. "Georg thought so for quite some time. He's a very thorough man. I think he had a whole plan to tell me, very gently, that my clock was wrong. He was rather sweet about the whole thing." "What did you say, when you finally explained?" "The same thing I'm saying to you," Lukas said. "One tells me the time here. The other tells me the time in my son's city. That way I don't accidentally call while he's still fast asleep." Petra capped her pen and closed her notebook. "That might be the nicest thing I've heard all month," she said. "It's a clock," said Lukas, with a modest wave of his hand. "It's very nice tea, though, isn't it?" Chapter 4. The House of Two Time Zones. An Unofficial Designation. The article ran the following Thursday, It was not a long article. 8 paragraphs. A small photograph of Mr. Lukas standing in his kitchen, gesturing at the 2 clocks with the expression of a man showing you something he considers rather self-evident. And a headline that Petra's editor had insisted on. Which was, "He has 2 clocks and both are correct. One Vienna man's sweet solution to staying connected." Petra had wanted something simpler. The editor had overruled her, as editors do. The article was pleasant, warm, and lightly funny in the way that local human interest pieces sometimes are, when the subject is genuinely interesting, and the writer is genuinely fond of them. It quoted Mr. Lukas on the subject of the 11-euro clock, on the subject of calling Edward, and on the subject of tea, which he insisted was relevant context. It mentioned the neighbor's confusion. It mentioned, briefly and tastefully, Marta. The effect on Birkenweg Lane was immediate and largely comedic. Georg Pickler read the article at breakfast, said, to Hild in a tone that suggested he was composing something, and then sent a very long message to the neighborhood group chat, which was called, uninspiringly, Birkenweg Residents, and which mostly contained reminders about bin days and weather complaints. That said, among other things, I want to clarify that I was never confused about the clocks, merely curious, and that I was the first person to visit Mr. Lukas on the matter, which I feel is relevant. Hild, who was in the same room, did not respond to this message. She sent a separate message saying the article was very lovely and Lukas always was a sensible man. 7 people liked Hild's message. 2 people liked Georg's. One of those was Georg himself. Renata, who had made the cake, was pleased to be mentioned, though she felt the article hadn't adequately emphasized that the plum cake had been particularly good that day, which she mentioned to Thomas, who told her this was not really the kind of thing one put in a newspaper, which led to a brief disagreement that was resolved before dinner. Thomas himself was somewhat vindicated by the article's mention of the neighbor's confusion, which he interpreted as supporting his original theory that the clocks were psychologically significant, even though the actual explanation was entirely practical. This seemed to satisfy him. Mrs. Brandt from number 14 sent a handwritten note to the newspaper, via actual post, with a stamp, saying that the whole affair was thoroughly sensible from beginning to end, and that more people should know what time it is in the places their loved ones live. The note was never published, but Petra saved it. The name, when it came, was Renata's contribution, though she would later generously distribute credit to the general collective. It happened the following Saturday morning, when a small cluster of neighbors were gathered outside the bakery in the way that people gather outside bakeries on Saturday mornings, when the bread has just come out and there is no particular urgency to be anywhere. Someone mentioned the article. Someone else said they'd shown it to their cousin. Someone else said they'd had more compliments on Mr. Lukas's house from their visiting relatives in the past week than in the previous decade combined. "We should call it something," Renata said, with the satisfied tone of a woman who has decided a thing. "His house. People keep saying, the house with the 2 clocks, but that's too long and a bit dry." "The clock house?" Georg offered. "That sounds like a pub," Hild said. "There's worse things to sound like." "The 2-time house?" someone else tried. "The house of 2 times," Renata said, testing it. Or 2 time zones. "The house of 2 time zones." There was a brief collective consideration of this, the way people consider suggestions that are just obviously right. "That's it," said Mrs. Brandt, who had arrived at some point in the discussion on her walking stick, and did not look remotely like she'd just come from a great distance. She had the habit of appearing where things were being decided. The house of 2 time zones. Somebody tell him. The honor of telling him fell, by some unspoken consensus, to Georg, who had appointed himself point of contact on the clock matter, and seemed to feel it was his responsibility to see things through to their conclusion. He knocked on Lukas's door that afternoon, was invited in for coffee, and delivered the neighborhood's decision with the slightly formal air of a man presenting a certificate. Mr. Lukas received this information with the particular brand of delighted bewilderment that belongs to people who are informed they have accidentally become interesting. The house of 2 time zones, he repeated. Unanimously agreed, Georg said. Well, mostly unanimously. Thomas abstained because he thought temporal dwelling sounded better, but we overruled him. Lukas shook his head slowly, smiling. He glanced up at the clocks. The old walnut one on the left, reliable and solemn. The cheerful cream one on the right, pleasantly oblivious to its own significance. All this, he said, because I didn't want to do arithmetic. All this, Georg agreed. Marta would have found it very funny, Lukas said. He said it lightly, with the ease of someone for whom the past is a comfortable companion rather than a weight. She always said my solutions were elaborate. Elaborate? Georg raised an eyebrow. It's 2 clocks. Elaborate for me, Lukas said cheerfully. I once spent 4 days building a shelf rather than just asking my neighbor to help for an afternoon. Georg considered this. Was the shelf good? It was not, Lukas said. But I built it myself, which counts for something. He leaned back, satisfied. I'll tell Edward. He'll be embarrassed on my behalf and find it endearing. He usually does. Chapter 5. The call at 8. The following Thursday, Mr. Lukas was in his kitchen at 2:30, which was where he always was. A few things had changed since the article. There was now, on the lane outside his house, an occasional tendency for people to slow down as they passed and gesture subtly at the building when speaking to visiting relatives. Not quite pointing, because pointing was rude, but the particular directed non-pointing of people who are showing someone something. Mrs. Leubner at the bakery had begun, when she served him, to say, "How's Edward?" with genuine expectation of an answer, rather than as a pleasantry. The neighborhood group chat had renamed itself, by a narrow vote, to Birkenweg Lane. The 2 time zones straight, which Georg thought was too long and Renata thought was perfect. And once, twice, Lukas had come home to find small things left on his doorstep. A jar of jam from number 8. A cutting of some plant whose name he didn't know but which he'd potted up by the kitchen window. Small offerings of the kind that neighborhoods extend when they have been reminded, by some incidental story, of what they feel. He'd put the plant on the windowsill where the afternoon light caught it. But Thursday at 2:30 was, as it always was, about the tea. He filled the copper kettle with exactly the right amount of water. He set it on the stove. He went to the third cupboard from the left and measured out the tea with the small silver spoon, into the white pot with the blue flower on the lid. Then he stood at the kitchen table and looked up at the wall. The left clock, the walnut one, the Vienna clock, showed 2:47 in the afternoon. The right clock, Toronto, Edward, the cheerful cream one. Showed 8:47 in the morning. Mr. Lukas smiled. He picked up the phone. It rang 4 times, and then Edward answered, slightly breathless, the way he always was at this time of morning, fresh from the short cycle to the office that he'd taken up last year and couldn't stop evangelizing about. Papa. Hang on, just unlocking the. There. Hi. Good morning, said Lukas. Or good afternoon. Depending. It's a very good morning, Edward said. His voice had a slight Canadian lilt now, barely noticeable, the corners of his vowels just gently softened by 4 years of immersion. Lukas had never mentioned it. He liked it. It meant his son was settled, comfortable, embedded in a life. I just passed the lake on my way in. The light on the water was incredible. Was it cold? A bit. Good cold, though. Wakes you up. The sound of a door, footsteps, the ambient murmur of an office just beginning its day. How are you? How's the garden? The lavender is very enthusiastic this year, Lukas said. I may need to stage an intervention. Edward laughed. Renata's been watering it again, hasn't she? I can't prove that, Lukas said carefully. I can only say that it seems very well attended for a plant I have not actively watered in 2 weeks. She did the same with Mum's roses that summer we were in Salzburg, Edward said. Remember? We came back and they were enormous. Mum thought it was the weather. It was a very dry summer, Lukas agreed, with the same tone of diplomatic neutrality he'd employed then. Has nothing to do with Renata. Nothing at all, said Edward cheerfully. They talked the way they always did. Easily, without urgency, the conversation assembling itself from the small material of daily life. Edward was working on a water drainage project for the city's eastern district. Lukas received a 40% comprehension of this, as usual, and found it genuinely interesting. Lukas had been to see a film the previous week and had found it confusing in a way that he suspected was intentional, but wasn't sure was rewarding. Edward said this sounded like several films he'd seen recently and asked which one it was. I don't remember the title, Lukas said. There was a great deal of water in it. Not in a good way. Sounds grim. The seats were comfortable. Well, Edward said. Important. 20 minutes passed in this way, as they usually did. Neither of them quite noticing the time, which was, Lukas thought, the best kind of phone call. Not one you were counting down, not one you'd scheduled and were relieved to finish, but one that simply happened and then stopped when it had said what it needed to say. Oh, Edward said, at some point toward the end. I heard from Hild Pickler last week, by the way. Lukas blinked. Hild Pickler. Georg's wife. She emailed me. Well, she emailed me through my work website, which was a bit of an adventure. I think she used the contact form for infrastructure consultations. Why would Hild Pickler email you? She'd read the article, Edward said, and Lukas could hear the smile in his voice. She wanted me to know that she thought the clocks were a lovely idea, and that my father was a very nice man, and that I should visit more often. Lukas closed his eyes briefly. Oh, good heavens. She also sent a very long postscript about the community garden rota, which I think was meant for someone else. That would be Georg's fault, Lukas said. He manages the group chat and occasionally sends things to the wrong places. She said everyone's very fond of you. Edward said. His voice had shifted slightly. Warmer, less breezy. She said the lane feels different since the article. More like a neighborhood. Her words. Lukas was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the lavender swayed in a light afternoon breeze. It's a very small thing, he said, finally. 2 clocks. I know, said Edward. But you know how it is. Small things. Yes, said Lukas. Small things. He glanced at the wall again. The Toronto clock had moved forward, as it always did. 8:51 now, Edward's morning marching on. In not too long, he'd have his first meeting of the day, and Lukas would have his second cup of tea, and they'd each get on with their Thursday in their respective time zones, 6 hours apart and entirely accounted for. Come at Christmas, Lukas said. Not to the lane. I mean. Well, yes, to the lane, obviously, but. Come home. I'm planning to. Edward said. The 23rd. Good. I'll have the good wine. You have the good wine every time I come. And every time you deserve it, Lukas said. Now go. You're at the office, I can hear people arriving. I am. Edward said. Good afternoon, Papa. Good morning, Lukas said. The good kind. He set the phone down on the counter and stood for a moment in his kitchen, in the quiet afternoon light, with his tea going pleasantly warm in the pot, and the lavender doing its enthusiastic business outside, and the 2 clocks on the wall doing what they had always done. Ticking away, steadily and correctly. One for here and one for there, keeping time in 2 places at once. He poured himself a cup. He sat down. Outside, somewhere on Birkenweg Lane, he could hear the familiar sound of Renata heading home from the community garden, calling hello to someone across the lane. He heard Georg's voice in return, loud and well-meaning, saying something about the group chat. He heard a dog bark twice and then stop, satisfied. He heard the ordinary afternoon sounds of a neighborhood getting on with itself. Mr. Lukas Hoffmann, entirely unremarkable and entirely content, drank his tea. Above him, on the kitchen wall, the 2 clocks ticked on. The old walnut one and the cheerful cream one, right and right, here and there, Vienna and Toronto. Keeping, between them, all the time that mattered. Later that autumn, Georg Pickler did buy a second clock for his own kitchen. A small white one, which he set to New Zealand time for his daughter. He spent 3 days trying to work out the exact offset, got it wrong twice, and on the 3rd attempt called Lukas, who told him in approximately 45 seconds. Georg hung the clock, stood back, and felt, quietly, that he understood now what all the fuss had been about. He did not tell anyone this. Some satisfactions are better kept.